The first one is by Dr. Palma-Robles. The topic is Strengthening Regional Maritime Cooperation in the Indian Ocean, the role of Australia-Sri Lanka bilateral relations. Let me do a very quick introduction of Dr. Robles. Dr. Palma-Robles is a visiting senior fellow at the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security, University of Wollongong, and holds a visiting senior research fellow position at the Centre for Sustainable Tropical Fisheries and Aquaculture of College of Science and Engineering, James Cook University. Am I right? Yeah, okay. Her research interest includes international fisheries, law and policy, maritime security, regional marine governance, and blue economy in the fishing sector. She has published widely on these topics, including a book on promoting sustainable fisheries. The international legal framework to combat illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. That is the title of the book. Okay. Dr. Palma-Robles obtained her Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Wollongong, Australia. She completed her master's degree from Dalhousie University in Canada and a bachelor degree from University of Philippines. She has undertaken research on fisheries and maritime cooperation funded by international organizations, Australian government agencies, foreign governments, and international non-governmental organizations. Her most recent research includes the impact of IUU fishing. You can elaborate on that. Fishing regulations on international fish trade, combating transnational crime in fisheries, and exploring fisheries cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. Okay, Mary, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for that introduction. Our distinguished guests and honorable officers from our defense forces, our Vice Chancellor, Rear Admiral Rana Singha, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'd like to personally thank and express my gratitude to the General Sir John Kotilawala Defense University for allowing me to participate in this conference. And also a personal thanks to the Vice Chancellor, who some of you would know as also coming from the University of Wollongong, just like me. So we have a little maritime policy mafia, and the Admiral is one of them. Your staff has also been very excellent, more than excellent actually, for looking after us. So thank you very much, sir. The topic of my presentation veers slightly away from fisheries. I won't be mainly discussing the need for strengthening regional maritime cooperation in the Indian Ocean, but to bridge the need for practical or more practical multilateral and bilateral cooperative mechanisms that function within the existing regional framework, but at the same time addressing strategic issues that promote national interest and development in the region. I would also be discussing very briefly the role of middle powers and small powers in regional maritime cooperation and highlighting the role of Sri Lanka in regional maritime cooperation in the Indian Ocean. And lastly, the importance of bilateral relations in achieving regional objectives as well as national security objectives. And with that, I'd like to highlight the bilateral relationship between Australia and Sri Lanka, specifically against people smuggling. Right, so maritime cooperation in the Indian Ocean takes different forms. There is a forum involving law enforcement agencies such as yourself. And they deal primarily with maritime security issues. And an example would be IONS. The IORA is an organization that deals broadly with different types of marine and maritime issues, one of which is maritime safety and security. Now, there's also a regional economic integration organization, which is SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, that partly addresses security issues that impact on economic growth. And I believe Sri Lanka has been a catalyst in implementing some of the activities of SAARC in relation to addressing organized crime. Now, within the regional framework is also global cooperation that addresses a regional scope. And an example would be the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. And it has a specific focus on the Indian Ocean through the Indian Ocean Maritime Crime Forum. Then you have the Gala Dialogue, the International Maritime Conference. Now, this is a coastal state-driven initiative. And of course, you're very much aware of this initiative. Now, within the Indian Ocean region, there's also a memorandum of understanding or an agreement that deals specifically with one issue, and that's port state control, that impacts on elements of maritime security. And that's the Indian Ocean Memorandum of Understanding on Port State Control. So each of these regional organizations or arrangements has a specific structure, a specific objective, and also memberships. And a lot of these organizations, if not all, do not only involve government officials, but also academics, researchers, and scientists like us. But in a regional forum or in a regional setting where there is internal conflict that's being addressed, the need to distribute wealth on an equal basis, ethnic or religious divisions, a more inward rather than an outward focus of regional cooperation would seem to be more beneficial. And the maritime sphere is a perfect area where we can address not only the security issues, but also the socio-economic development issues that we face in the region. Now, of course, there are a number of benefits to regional cooperation. It provides us, or it establishes regional common policies. It becomes an inclusive forum for discussion of common maritime issues. It allows increased flow and sharing of information. But in any regional organization, of course, there's an ongoing attempt to balance power politics. Now, there are also weaknesses of a regional cooperation. The bigger the regional organization, the more varied the differences, the more varied the challenges, the wider the geographical scope, and therefore sometimes the issues that are being discussed or being addressed are those issues raised by the most vocal or the states that have more influence in the regional organization. And sometimes they're the extra-regional powers. And so often it doesn't really reflect the concern of the majority of the littoral states. And that's one of the issues being faced by small powers in a regional setting. So we all know that there are different theories about powers in international relations. So there's an argument that the major powers are the drivers to policy making, and that the middle powers and the small powers are the ones that can only influence policy making. There's also an argument that the major powers in the Indian Ocean region are continuously competing with each other to maintain their dominance in the region. And corollary to that, smaller states now are being seen as having a strategic position in order to have their alliance with whatever state or whatever power will allow them to have more benefit. So that's why they're now called strategic states. So a lot of analysts call middle powers and small powers as strategic states. But in a maritime domain, and based on the Law of the Sea Convention, there are a number of actors, the coastal states, or the littoral states. You have the coastal states that can exercise or can project more sea power compared to other coastal states. And you also have the accessing states, or the distant flag states, or what you call extra-regional states, that based on the freedoms allowed under the Law of the Sea Convention have certain rights in the coastal state waters. So there's always a continuous balance or power play within a maritime region because of also the legal sphere that it works in. Now, Sri Lanka, for example, I strongly believe that a smaller power like Sri Lanka would not negotiate based on simply on the immediate benefit that it can derive from a major power, but rather it's trying to position itself. It is having strategic relationships, not just with major powers in the region, but other states, for example, in Southeast Asia. And therefore, the relationship that Sri Lanka has now with the US, Japan, China, they're slowly evolving because this country is aware of the value of its resources and also its potential, that its negotiating power has actually increased as a result of that knowledge of what it has in the maritime domain. Now, Sri Lanka, as we know, apart from the resources, has major ports where they're used as logistical hubs for your navies and Coast Guard visits, but also it's in the middle, right in the smack of the trade happening in the Indian Ocean. It is a good example of a coastal state that is confronted by numerous maritime challenges, but at the same time, it has an increasing independence and also capability to address such issues. It has wide experience and success in dealing with non-state actors, which is of very good value to other countries in the region. So as such, it can be seen as a smaller state that has an increasing power within the Indian Ocean region, that it's been successful not only in addressing internal conflict, but also it is an active participant in sub-regional and regional organization. And other smaller states within the region also have the same opportunity when it comes to dealing with other regional maritime actors. The other point that I'd like to make is the function of bilateral cooperations. Now, there are different benefits to bilateral relations. Bilateral cooperation is seen to be effective because it's more focused in approach, and often two countries have or devote their political and financial commitment to resolve a common issue or to achieve a particular goal. And by that, it also is able to promote its national interests. Now, there are also certain disadvantages. Often, a bilateral agreement is limited in time frame, and also it's very susceptible to political changes. However, there are a number of bilateral arrangements in the Indian Ocean region that you could say is becoming to be a building block for regional cooperation. So Australia-Sri Lanka bilateral relations is an example of a middle power, small power, a good example of a relationship that drives and influences regional cooperation. So for decades, Australia and Sri Lanka have focused on a number of concerns, which are trade and investment, education, sports and culture, development assistance, human rights and reconciliation, and combating transnational crime. It has what it's called a maritime cooperation, a bilateral cooperation on maritime area. And it's basically focused on a particular issue, which is to combat people smuggling. And this is in relation to asylum, particularly asylum seekers coming to the Australian shores either by boat or transiting in another country and then being taken by boat into Australia. So as a result, there is a joint working group on people smuggling and other transnational crime. There is a new memorandum of understanding. There's been donation of naval assets, but also there's been a cooperation between the Sri Lankan Navy, also the Australian Border Force, also the Australian Federal Police, involving crime intelligence sharing, human smuggling investigation, and also customs cooperation. So basically all these types of police work and also a bit of training. More recently, there's been a joint statement by both the Prime Ministers of Australia and Sri Lanka. The new joint declaration on enhanced cooperation between Australia and Sri Lanka come in, for specific issues: security and defense cooperation, economic cooperation, development cooperation, education, and people-to-people links. And so even if it's called more of a defense and security cooperation, we could see that the content of the new declaration also looks at socioeconomic development and not just maritime security issues. Apart from that, both countries have committed to strengthen regional norms and cooperation through regional forums, mainly IORA, IONS that we've discussed, and also extra-regionally through the ASEAN Regional Forum and the Bali process on people smuggling. So there's now enhanced police and legal cooperation and also Navy-to-Navy links. And they want to establish more ties in terms of other things such as education and training. Okay. So those basically, it's just one example of a bilateral relationship that drives and influences regional cooperation in the region. And it's a good example in that other bilateral cooperation can also evolve from such an example. So what I have here is I've just summarized some of the key points where there's a link between the multilateral cooperation and a bilateral cooperation. So regional cooperation provides that overall framework within which littoral states can address common maritime issues as well as put forward national interests. The small and middle power states are in a strategic position to influence decision-making and politics in a regional setting. Now Sri Lanka is building both strategic and long-standing relationships with key players in the Indian Ocean, and the relationship between Australia and Sri Lanka on enhanced maritime cooperation is a good example of a bilateral cooperation that addresses immediate threats within a global and regional framework of security cooperation. So I hope that this also provides, a working framework for some of the discussions that that we'll have in the conference for the other plenaries. So I'm happy to take the questions after this, sir. Thank you very much.